really what this comes down to is what is Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin is commonly understood as being an anarcho-capitalist currency because the rules of the Bitcoin game are essentially anarcho-capitalist. You have anonymity, you have a free market, and whatever it is that people can find a way of buying and selling, there's no central regulation or oversight. In the early stages of Bitcoin were much more anarcho-capitalist because it's pre-Bitcoin Foundation, and there was a much broader acknowledgement that the developers and miners were acting as individuals rather than as guilds that could potentially exert monopoly power. So you could think of this as being the sort of pre-formation of a guild Bitcoin golden age, right? Everybody's acting as individuals, the currency is operated essentially as on a volunteer basis, a little bit of money is made and value exchanged, but it's fundamentally pretty decentralized. There are no strong internal power structures. And in that condition, it's very hard to distinguish between anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, and libertarian socialism because everybody is happy and there are no power structures to impose force on people. So you don't understand the rules that the power structures are playing by because there aren't any. It's basically got the kind of dynamics of a cocktail party where it's really not clear when you have a cocktail party, whether the drinks have already been paid for and you're at a bar or whether everybody brought their own booze and you've got somebody mixing for fun. Right, you look around the room, it's happy, smiling people drinking, you can't tell what the governance structure is. Then you get the formation of the Bitcoin Foundation and you get centralization of the mining guilds. And all of a sudden you've got people that have got tons of structural power. The mining guild that keeps just less than 50% of the mining capacity clearly could have just more than 50% and then they'd run the show. Well, how do we stop that happening? Well, right now they're voluntarily choosing not to do it. But that's the beginning of real politics. The Bitcoin Foundation centralizing the finance for the developing team, right? That's a huge beginning of a centralization as well. And once you get centralized power, you begin to understand what the rules of your game actually are. So Bitcoin doesn't have a strong property right that allows top-down control of the Bitcoin systems, because it was originally written in a very anarchist form where it was run by voluntary cooperation. There is no owner of Bitcoin. So if Bitcoin had been developed by a proprietary company, Bitcoin Inc., there'd be no denying that when it came push meets shove, the property right would decide who was in charge and Bitcoin Inc. would own the Bitcoin network. A parallel example would be BitTorrent, right? There is a BitTorrent company, it owns the protocol, it produces the software. You could be compatible with the BitTorrent network, but if the BitTorrent company changes its mind about how BitTorrent works, that's the official story, that's the end of the story, you're done. So in Bitcoin, every time you've got to do something like a fork of the blockchain because of some technical problem, which has happened a few times, the question is who has the authority to do that? Not who has the power, but who has the legitimacy. And that question is unanswered because the original construction of Bitcoin is that it's anarchic, but inside of anarcho-capitalism, all of the heavy political decisions are made by use of property rights. And in the Bitcoin system, there is no property right because Bitcoin exists pre-capture. Right? It has not taken the anarchic network's beginning and turned it into a set of property rights which become tradable as a way of generating essentially political legitimacy. That problem is extremely severe because most of the Bitcoiners think that they are fundamentally anarcho-capitalists, but in an anarcho-capitalist construct, a company produces the income, a company produces the money. So the currency would be produced by a private enterprise which would have owners. They would own and regulate the currency and everything would work like clockwork until you stop being able to trust them. The Bitcoin network, anarchist, proper anarchist, no centralization of authority. And as people create the centralization of authority, you can hear the ordinary Bitcoiners beginning to scream, like, wait a minute, we thought this was libertarian. If it was libertarian, it would have been owned by somebody from the beginning. It's anarchist, but to accept anarchy in a really fundamental way, you have to start challenging the meaning of property. And Bitcoin sits at this very uneasy juncture that it's a bunch of anarchists cooperating to create a libertarian micro-enclave, even though they don't actually agree about the fundamental meaning of the word property. And this is extremely problematic. Right? If they can get through that political storm, they might finally succeed in producing a genuine libertarian anarchism, And that would be an extremely powerful thing. But it's more likely that the anarchists will get suppressed by the libertarians, and in the long run you'll wind up with an anarcho-capitalist enclave, because the Bitcoin Foundation will wind up owning Bitcoin outright, and that property right will be a monopoly, which is then used to enforce their policy decisions, including collaboration with the US government. And this is the real distinction between anarchism and anarcho-capitalism, which is that under anarcho-capitalism, you can have a monopoly that winds up controlling everything, and then they make deals that you disagree with. In anarchism, nobody has enough wherewithal in the network to be able to make a deal for everybody, and if people disagree, they do something else. Right? In an anarchist context, there wouldn't be one Bitcoin, there would be 30 of them, and if one of them sells out or grows up, you just stop using it. You know? Because anarchism is incompatible with monopolies. As soon as you have a monopoly, whether you like it or not, you're operating inside of a power structure. You have a king. The king is the guy who owns the monopoly. You have a ruler. And anarchism is about operating without rulers. You can have a ruler de facto willed into existence by a monopoly. What do you do at that point? You're no longer anarchists. The libertarian socialism angle, the old name for communism is libertarian socialism. And that kind of communism was basically envisaged as networks of villages that all had minimalist local governance to keep everything running, produced an agricultural surplus, and allowed people to spend their leisure time how they liked. It was basically utopian dreaming in much the same model as the Amish. And the Amish are probably closer to much of the original thinking behind communism than anybody else. Networks of communes in which people self-govern and control how they live. You can easily imagine that if we had a real network of communes that worked that way, Bitcoin-type currencies might be a useful way for them to exchange without having to create a hierarchical currency issuing institution like a central bank. But if you don't have the pre-existing network of communes, or you don't have the pre-existing anarchist society, all that will happen is that capitalism will capture Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin will become part of the same apparatus of capture that took all of the other natural resources. Right? If you've got to pay for water, you will eventually have to pay for dollars for a Bitcoin license. And they'll have your ID card, and it'll all be recorded. And it'll still be called Bitcoin. See what I'm saying? Right? Now, what are the alternatives to this, right? To get out of this kind of trap, you need to start thinking very carefully about the distinction between markets and free exchange, right? The sort of illusion that you see all the way through the kind of Bitcoin world is that free markets exist. And the truth is that free markets only exist when you have free people. Free people will create a free market. Free markets will not necessarily create free people. And this is the core logical fallacy inside of the libertarian ethos. If you've got an environment where people are actually free, they will choose to freely exchange goods and services with each other, market values will be established, everything will be fine. If you have an environment where people are not free and then you give them access to a market, you don't have a free market. What you have is a market existing inside of somebody else's regulatory framework, and the market will take on and be colored by those dynamics. And this is an enormously important distinction, right? Once you accept that the free market doesn't exist without pre-existing free people, then we don't mean free market. What we mean is governed market, controlled market, capitalist market, democratic market. Even if it looks free, every time that somebody comes into the situation and says, right, you stole his stuff and you're going to give it back and then we're going to fine you, you're no longer operating inside of a free market. The structure of your market is now maintained by the state. Or it's maintained by the Hells Angels, or it's maintained by the UN, or it's maintained by the mathematics behind Bitcoin. But this free market thing exists as an abstraction. It doesn't really exist anywhere, except in temporary zones of autonomous exchange where people meet and have nothing to lose or gain by trading and are operating outside of the control of their local state structures. So, you know, travelers who meet at a border might have moments of free markets, right? This is very, no, let's see if I can get this into pieces. So the reason that this matters particularly for Bitcoin is this. The vast majority of the people using Bitcoin are politically shallow. They are young. They haven't done a ton of political theory because they're largely concerned with making the thing work. The problem is that Bitcoin has succeeded technically and is midway through the process of failing politically. right? And it's failing politically because nobody could define what success looked like. The creation of an anarcho-capitalist enclave inside of society, largely driven by things like Silk Road, was a very interesting goal for an enormous number of people. But for that to work, they had to solve the problem of how do you do strong property rights within the system and no property rights to operate the system as a whole. So it had to be anarchist infrastructure producing a libertarian trading environment. And I don't think anybody understood that problem clearly until very recently. Until you solve that problem, you can't decentralize the control of the currency, but still have a single uniform agreement that everybody is playing by. And that political problem, that's not so different to the problem at the heart of managing things like climate change. How do we get a bunch of people to be able to cooperate without appointing a single ruler to be able to govern everything for them? Bitcoin has that problem, climate negotiation has that problem. Bitcoin is going through the process of solving that problem by appointing a czar. It's called the foundation. If they choose to turn away from that, is it going to be that the developers run the show and anybody can be a developer if they've got the skills? Is it going to be that Bitcoin users vote and one vote is equal to one Bitcoin? Which is, by the way, perfectly cryptographically feasible. You could have a Bitcoin election where the rich vote more than the poor, because you can't verify one person per vote, but you can verify one Bitcoin per vote. Lots of possibilities. But it cannot be divorced, and this is the part that I was digging for, it cannot be divorced from pre-existing political theory. Right? When you get to this fundamental question of who is in charge here, it's going to be one of the things that we've already discovered, or it's going to be something new. But the really hard case is where we are with Bitcoin, which is it's something old that nobody is willing to name. Because nobody really understands the distinction between anarchism and anarcho-capitalism. Everybody talks about Bitcoin as libertarian when it's actually either anarchist or anarcho-capitalist. And it's that mechanism where, you take this kind of anarchist thing that operates because nobody really cares about it, and then you try and regulate it into a libertarian framework that is causing the tearing in Bitcoin. And because they don't have the background in political theory, most of the argument is rediscovering this stuff rather than going back and looking at, say, Murray Rothbard. Right? It's extremely important to understand that these problems have been analysed before. There's a long history of people who have got the tools to do the structural analysis. People like Centre for a Stateless Society, I had Kevin Carson's outfit. But until the Bitcoin community admits that it's got political problems rather than technical problems, they're trapped.